The Zenithari Empire had been running the galaxy like a particularly efficient filing cabinet for the better part of 3 millennia. 47 star systems, each catalogued, processed and organized according to their comprehensive xenobiological assessment protocol, which was exactly as thrilling as it sounds. The Empire prided itself on being civilized, which, in their case, meant they'd perfected the art of systematic oppression while maintaining impeccable. At the apex of this bureaucratic nightmare sat the Zenithari themselves, 12-foot-tall crystalline beings who communicated through harmonized frequencies and considered emotions a design flaw. They'd built their empire on the simple principle that intelligence could be measured by one's ability to fill out forms in triplicate, and naturally, they'd scored themselves highest on every metric that mattered. The galaxy's other species had been neatly categorized into 3 groups: useful, tolerable, and specimens. The Kithara, with their natural talent for engineering, were useful. The Vex, who at least had the decency to be predictably violent, were tolerable. And humans? Well, humans were specimens. Curious little creatures who'd somehow stumbled into space travel despite possessing the collective emotional regulation of caffeinated squirrels. The Zenithari Research Division maintained 17 facilities across their territory, each dedicated to studying the galaxy's more interesting species. They called it Advancing Galactic Understanding Through Controlled Observation, because apparently even torture needed a mission statement these days. The facilities were pristine, efficient, and completely soundproof, a design choice that definitely wasn't ominous at all. Dr. Kempf IV, the Empire's chief xenobiologist, had published extensively on the subject of human psychology. His most famous paper, Primitive Emotional Responses in Recently Spacefaring Mammals, had won the Galactic Academy's award for outstanding condescension. In it, he'd concluded that humans were fascinating specifically because they were so wonderfully, tragically stupid. The research subjects were acquired through the Empire's Specimen Collection Protocol, a process so bureaucratically complex that it somehow made kidnapping seem like a reasonable administrative function. Collection ships would arrive at human colonies, present their paperwork, and politely explain that they were commandeering a few citizens for the advancement of science. The fact that humans objected was considered further proof of their primitive nature. The Empire's greatest achievement wasn't their technology or their territorial expansion, it was their ability to make atrocity feel routine. They'd systematized cruelty until it became just another Tuesday in the office. Even their collection agents filled out satisfaction surveys after each raid. But here's the thing about filing systems. They work beautifully until someone decides to burn the whole cabinet down. The colony of Kepler 442b was having what the locals generously called a Tuesday when the Zenithari collection vessel descended through the atmosphere with all the grace of a falling refrigerator. The ship itself was a masterpiece of functional ugliness, all angles and efficiency, like someone had asked an accountant to design a spaceship. Lyra Thorne was elbow-deep in the colony's atmospheric processor when the shadow fell across her workshop. She looked up to see the vessel settling onto the landing pad with the kind of casual authority that immediately made everyone nervous. The Zenithari didn't make social calls. "Well," she muttered, wiping grease from her hands, "this is either very good or catastrophically bad." Her younger brother Phoenix was less philosophical about the whole thing. At 19, he possessed the kind of idealistic optimism that made him believe the best of everyone, including 12-foot-tall crystalline bureaucrats with a hobby of collecting sapient beings. He was also the kind of person who would try to negotiate with a black hole, which made him both endearing and occasionally exhausting. "Maybe they're here for trade," Phoenix suggested, watching the ship's boarding ramp extend with mechanical precision. Lyra gave him the look that older sisters had been perfecting since the dawn of time. "Right. And maybe they're here to discuss the weather." The collection agent that emerged from the ship was designated Vorth 7, and he approached their little gathering with the enthusiasm of someone auditing a particularly dull tax return. In his manipulator appendages, he carried what appeared to be a clipboard, because apparently even cosmic horror needed proper documentation. "Citizens of Kepler 442b, Vorth 7 announced in a voice that sounded like wind chimes, having an existential crisis. I am here to execute Collection Protocol 47B under the authority of the Zenithari Research Division. The colony's administrator, a woman named Kestrel, whom everyone suspected had been a pirate in her previous life, stepped forward with the kind of smile that suggested she was calculating the distance to the nearest weapon. And what exactly does that mean? It means, Vault 7 consulted his clipboard with the reverence of someone reading religious scripture, that I am authorized to collect 12 human specimens for transportation to research facilities Zeta 9. The selection criteria include diverse age ranges, varying skill sets, and optimal genetic markers for study. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either very polite negotiations or very impolite violence. "Over my dead body," Kestrel said pleasantly. "That can be arranged," Vault 7 replied, apparently missing the part where that was supposed to be a threat rather than a request for services. What followed was less a battle and more a demonstration of why the Zenithari had conquered 47 star systems, while humans were still arguing about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. The collection team's stun weapons dropped the colony's defenders with the casual efficiency of someone swatting flies. Lyra watched her brother collapse mid-sentence, his optimistic protest about interspecies cooperation cut short by a blue bolt of energy. She lunged forward, and the last thing she saw before her own nervous system decided to take a vacation was Phoenix being loaded onto the ship like cargo. When she woke up 6 hours later, the Zenithari ship was gone, and with it, the only person in the galaxy who still believed that reasonable people could solve problems through reasonable conversation. The thing about Lyra Thorne that the Zenithari had failed to include in their assessment was that she'd been raised by a woman who'd once punched a hole through a titanium bulkhead with her bare hands. Her mother had been a soldier, her grandmother had been a soldier, and her great-grandmother had been the kind of person who solved diplomatic crises by demonstrating superior firepower. Violence, as it turned out, was very much a family tradition. The colony had emergency protocols for Zenithari raids. Most human settlements did these days. But those protocols were designed around the assumption that you'd lose some people and file a complaint with the Galactic Mediation Council, who would then spend 6 months processing your paperwork before explaining why nothing could be done. Lyra had different ideas about acceptable losses. She spent the first week after Phoenix's abduction doing what any reasonable person would do. She got very, very drunk and punched several walls. The walls won, but it made her feel better. The second week, she started planning. The colony's archives contained detailed records of every Zenithari raid in the sector over the past decade. Lyra studied them with the kind of methodical intensity that her engineering professors would have recognized, and probably feared. She mapped patrol routes, analyzed ship configurations, and compiled a database of Zenithari research facilities that would have impressed their own bureaucrats. She also started building things, weapons mostly, but also scanning equipment, communication jammers, and what could generously be called infiltration tools. The fact that most of these devices were technically illegal under 17 different galactic treaties was, as far as Lyra was concerned, someone else's problem. Her first target was a Zenithari supply convoy passing through the Kepler system. The attack lasted exactly 4 minutes and left no survivors, which was both efficient and morally questionable. More importantly, it left her with a captured Zenithari transport ship and enough military-grade equipment to arm a small rebellion. The Empire's response was predictably bureaucratic. They filed a report, launched an investigation, and issued a formal complaint about unauthorized violence against legitimate research operations. What they didn't do was increase security or change their operational patterns, because that would have required admitting that their filing system had a design flaw. By the time the Zenithari realized they had a problem, Lyra had already hit 3 more convoys, 2 research stations, and a detention facility. She'd also acquired a small but enthusiastic crew of former specimens who'd decided that revenge was more satisfying than therapy. The galaxy's most organized empire was being systematically dismantled by someone who'd learned military tactics from her grandmother's war stories and engineering from fixing atmospheric processes. Admiral Korath 9 was the kind of Zenithari who'd climbed the ranks by being exceptionally good at killing things efficiently. His service record included 17 successful planetary pacifications, 43 police actions, and one particularly memorable incident involving a rebel base and what could only be described as aggressive urban renewal. He was also the first Zenitari commander to admit that they might have made a mistake. "Explain to me," he said, his harmonized voice carrying the kind of frequency that made everyone in the room's teeth ache, "how a single human female has managed to destroy 37 Imperial assets in the space of 6 months. The briefing room aboard the Imperial dreadnought Inexorable contained 12 of the Empire's finest military minds, each of whom was currently trying very hard to look like they weren't personally responsible for the current situation. The holographic display showed a map of the sector, with red marks indicating destroyed facilities, hijacked ships, and what the reports euphemistically called personnel losses. "She appears to be highly motivated," offered Commander Senth 12, whose own ship had been the victim of what intelligence was calling the recycling station incident. "Motivated." Korath 9 repeated the word like it tasted unpleasant. "She's systematically dismantling 3,000 years of Imperial expansion because she's motivated. The psychological profile suggests extreme emotional attachment to the captured specimen," added Dr. Kenth 4, who'd been pulled from his research to explain how his primitive mammals had developed such inconvenient combat skills. "Humans form irrational bonds with their genetic relatives. It's quite fascinating from a—" "Doctor," Korath 9 interrupted, "I don't care if it's fascinating. I care that she's turned half the sector into a war zone." The truth was more complicated than that, but the Empire had never been particularly good with complicated truths. Lyra Thorne hadn't just started a war, she'd started a revolution. Every species that had ever been collected for research was suddenly discovering that the Empire's military might was more fragile than advertised. The Kithara had always been useful, but now they were being useful to the wrong side. The Vex had been tolerable, but now they were being intolerant of Imperial authority. Even the Morlocks, who'd been classified as barely sentient for the past millennium, had started hijacking Imperial supply ships. "She's made them believe they can win," Korath 9 realized, staring at the tactical display. "One human female has convinced half the galaxy that the Empire is vulnerable." "Technically," Dr. Kenth 4 said helpfully, "she's demonstrated that the Empire is vulnerable. The belief is simply an accurate assessment of current conditions." Korath 9's response was the kind of low-frequency harmonic that made everyone in the room suddenly very interested in studying their feat. The Empire's solution was characteristically direct. They would locate the human female, eliminate her and her crew, and then conduct educational demonstrations on a few dozen colony worlds to remind everyone why rebellion was a bad idea. It was a perfectly reasonable plan, with only one small flaw: they had to find her first. Research Facility Zeta 9 was the Empire's crown jewel, a massive orbital platform that had been studying primitive species for the better part of 2 centuries. It was also, according to the intelligence Lyra had gathered, where they were keeping Phoenix. The facility was defended by enough firepower to level a small moon, surrounded by an early warning network that could detect approaching ships from 3 star systems away, and staffed by the Empire's most competent researchers and security personnel. Lyra's plan for getting inside was elegantly simple. She walked up to the front door and knocked. "This is Lyra Thorne," she announced over the facility's communication array, her stolen Zenitari ship sitting in full view of their sensors. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The response was immediate and predictable. Defense platforms swiveled to target her ship, security alerts echoed throughout the facility, and someone, probably Dr. Kenth 4's replacement, began organizing what would undoubtedly be a very stern lecture about proper protocol for specimen retrieval. What they didn't expect was for her ship to be empty. Rex and Lyra had been aboard the facility for 6 hours by the time they realized their mistake. The stolen ship had been a distraction, launched on autopilot while she'd approached the facility in a maintenance pod she'd acquired during her most recent raid. It was amazing what you could accomplish when your enemies assumed you were too primitive to be devious. The facility's interior was exactly what she'd expected. sterile corridors, humming machinery, and the kind of clinical efficiency that made everything feel vaguely medicinal. The holding cells were in Section 7, according to the schematics she'd memorized, past the research labs and through what the blueprints labeled as specimen processing. She found Phoenix in cell 47B, looking thinner than she remembered but still possessed of that stubborn optimism that made him insufferable. He was sitting in lotus position, apparently meditating, because of course he was. "You know," he said without opening his eyes, "I was wondering when you'd show up." "How did you—" she began, then stopped. "Never mind. Are you hurt?" "Defined hurt." He stood, stretching muscles that had clearly been inactive for too long. "They've been very polite about the whole thing. Lots of questions about human psychology, cultural development, and whether we're actually sapient or just very good at pretending." "And what did you tell them?" Phoenix grinned, and for the first time in months, Lyra remembered why she'd missed him. "I told them we're still figuring that out ourselves." The escape plan was supposed to be simple: get Phoenix, get out, and disappear into the vast emptiness of space before the Empire could organize a pursuit. But the thing about plans is that they rarely survive contact with the enemy, or in this case, with Phoenix's conscience. "We can't leave the others," he said, standing in the corridor outside his cell with his arms crossed. "Aren't it?" "The other specimens. There are 47 of them in this facility alone. Different species, different worlds, all taken for the same reason I was." Lyra stared at him. "You want to rescue 47 aliens?" "I want to rescue 47 people." "Phoenix, we don't have time for a humanitarian mission. Every second we stay here increases the chances of—" "Then we'd better hurry." That was how Lyra found herself leading a jailbreak that included 2 Kithara engineers, 6 Vex warriors, 12 Morlocks who communicated entirely through interpretive dance, and 27 members of species she'd never heard of, but who seemed enthusiastic about the concept of violent revenge. The escape itself was less elegant than she'd hoped. Alarms blared, security forces converged on their position, and someone, probably Dr. Kinth 4's replacement, was announcing over the intercom that unauthorized personnel were violating 17 different research protocols. But here's the thing about the Empire's security forces. They'd been trained to handle individual escape attempts, not coordinated rebellions led by someone who'd spent the last 6 months studying their tactical doctrines. Lyra had learned to think like a Zenithari, which meant she could anticipate their responses and plan accordingly. She'd also learned to fight like a human, which meant she could do things that their tactical doctrines said were impossible. The facility's defenders found themselves facing an enemy who used their own corridors against them, turned their security systems into weapons, and demonstrated a distressing tendency to make things explode at precisely the wrong moment. By the time reinforcements arrived, the facility's detention center was in ruins, and its former specimens were loose throughout the station. "This is Admiral Karath 9, came the voice over the emergency channel. "Facility Zeta 9, report your status." The response came from Dr. Kinth 4, whose voice carried the kind of hysteria that suggested his day had not gone according to plan. "Admiral, the facility has been compromised. The specimens have escaped, and—" "Doctor, I don't care about the specimens. I care about the human female." There was a pause. "Sir, she's not just taken the specimens. She's taken the entire facility." The Bridge of Research Facility Zeta 9 was designed to be a monument to Zenithari efficiency. Clean lines, perfect symmetry, and control systems that responded to harmonized frequencies with the precision of a well-tuned instrument. It was not designed to accommodate a human female with a talent for creative destruction and a very personal grudge against the galactic establishment. Lyra stood in the center of the bridge, surrounded by displays showing the facility's vital systems, while her newly liberated army of former specimens secured the rest of the station. The Vex had taken the armory, the Kithara had commandeered the engineering sections, and the Morlocks were doing something in the hydroponics bay that she was pretty sure she didn't want to know about. "You know," Phoenix said, settling into what had been the facility commander's chair, "I have to admit, this wasn't what I expected when I woke up this morning." "What did you expect?" On the day of explaining to Dr. Kinth 4 why humans cry when they're sad, He's been very confused about the whole concept of emotional expression. Lyra was examining the facility's communication array, which was currently receiving increasingly frantic messages from Admiral Karath-9. The Empire's finest military mind was apparently having some difficulty accepting that his research facility had been conquered by the people it had been studying. Facility Zeta-9, this is Admiral Karath-9. You will surrender the stolen facility and return all specimens to their designated containment areas. This is your final warning. Lyra activated the communication system. Admiral, this is Lyra Thorne. I'm afraid there's been a change in management. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either very diplomatic negotiations or very undiplomatic orbital bombardment. Miss Thorne, came the Admiral's voice, carrying the kind of controlled fury that suggested he was having a very bad day. You are in violation of 47 Imperial statutes, 16 galactic treaties, and at least 3 natural laws that I'm not entirely sure how you've managed to break. I prefer to think of it as creative interpretation. You will surrender immediately, or I will be forced to destroy the facility with all hands aboard, including your own research staff. Another pause. Acceptable losses. I see. Lyra studied the tactical display, which showed the Admiral's dreadnought moving into bombardment position. Well, Admiral, I have a counter-proposal. I'm listening. You're going to recall every collection ship in the sector, release every specimen in Imperial custody, and formally apologize to the Galactic Council for 3,000 years of systematic atrocities. And if I refuse? Lyra smiled and activated the facility's self-destruct sequence. Then we're all going to find out whether your ship's shields can withstand the explosion of a research facility that's been studying exotic matter for the past 2 centuries. The tactical display showed Admiral Karath-9's dreadnought immediately reversing course, because apparently even the Empire's finest military minds preferred not to be vaporized by their own research projects. You're bluffing, came the Admiral's voice, but there was uncertainty in the harmonics. Phoenix, Lyra called to her brother, what's the one thing you learned about humans during your time in Imperial custody? Phoenix grinned. That we're all completely insane, and we make decisions based on emotional attachments rather than logical analysis. And what does that suggest about my current mental state? You're absolutely crazy enough to blow up a research facility just to make a point. Thank you, Lyra turned back to the communication array. Admiral, you have 10 minutes to begin compliance with my demands, otherwise I'm going to demonstrate why studying humans in captivity might not have given you the complete picture. What followed was the most expensive negotiation in galactic history. Admiral Karath-9 spent the next 3 hours receiving increasingly urgent communications from the Imperial Council, who had suddenly discovered that maintaining their research program wasn't worth the cost of rebuilding their entire fleet. The final agreement was surprisingly simple. The Empire would cease all specimen collection activities, release all current captives, and pay reparations to affected species. In exchange, Lyra would not detonate a research facility that contained enough exotic matter to sterilize half the sector. This is not over, Admiral Karath-9 transmitted as his fleet began its withdrawal. Yes, it is, Lyra replied. You just don't know it yet. The collapse of the Zenithori Empire didn't happen overnight, but it was remarkably thorough when it finally occurred. The revelation that their primitive specimens had successfully conquered one of their most secure facilities caused a crisis of confidence that rippled through every level of Imperial society. Species that had been classified as useful suddenly decided they were useful to themselves rather than the Empire. Worlds that had been tolerable became intolerant of Imperial taxation, and everywhere the former specimens were demonstrating that they'd learned quite a lot during their time in Imperial custody, including how to operate Imperial technology, decode Imperial communications, and exploit Imperial bureaucracy. The Galactic Council, which had spent 3 millennia rubber-stamping Imperial policy, suddenly found itself dealing with 47 different independence movements, each armed with stolen Imperial weapons, and led by beings who'd been personally offended by the Empire's research methods. Lyra established herself as the coordinator of what historians would later call the Specimen Uprising, operating from the captured research facility that she'd renamed New Defiance. Her first official act was to establish the Free Species Coalition, a mutual defense pact between every world that had been victimized by imperial collection protocols. Her second act was to put Phoenix in charge of diplomatic relations, because someone had to keep her from declaring war on the entire galaxy. "You know," he said, reviewing the latest intelligence reports from the former imperial territories, "I never thought I'd miss the simplicity of being a research subject." They were standing in what had been Dr. Kent Four's laboratory, which was now serving as their command center. The walls were covered with star charts, tactical displays, and what appeared to be a very complex flowchart showing the organizational structure of the new galactic government. "Simple problems," Lyra agreed. "Simple solutions. And now we have to figure out how to run a galaxy without turning into the thing we just destroyed." The final Imperial holdouts surrendered 8 months later, when their last remaining fleet was surrounded by a coalition armada that included ships from every species they'd ever studied. Admiral Korath 9 transmitted his formal surrender to Lyra personally, his harmonized voice carrying what might have been respect or might have been exhaustion. "The Zenithari Empire formally transfers all territorial claims and governmental authority to the Free Species Coalition," he announced. "We acknowledge the superiority of your organizational methods." "Thank you, Admiral," Lyra replied. "Your cooperation is noted and appreciated. May I ask what will happen to my people?" Lyra considered the question. The Zenithari had spent 3 millennia classifying every other species as either useful, tolerable, or suitable for experimentation. Their entire civilization had been built on the premise that some beings were inherently superior to others, and that superior beings had the right to do whatever they wanted to their inferiors. "You'll be treated with the same respect you showed everyone else," she said finally. The silence that followed was the kind that carried the weight of 3,000 years of accumulated karma. "However," she continued, "my brother has convinced me that everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. The Zenithari people will be relocated to a single system, where you'll be free to rebuild your civilization according to whatever principles you choose. You'll be monitored but not harmed. And if we refuse, then you'll be treated with exactly the same respect you showed everyone else." Admiral Korath 9's response was a harmonized frequency that might have been laughter or might have been despair. 5 years later, the Free Species Coalition had grown from a desperate alliance of former victims into something that almost resembled a functional government. Almost. There were still 47 different species trying to agree on everything from tax policy to the proper way to address interspecies correspondence, but they were doing it through diplomatic conferences rather than military conquest. Lyra had officially retired from active leadership, leaving the day-to-day governance to beings who were better suited to the tedious business of democracy. She'd returned to Kepler 442b, where she'd rebuilt the atmospheric processor that had been damaged during the original Zenithari raid. Phoenix had stayed in the capital, serving as the Coalition's Secretary of Interspecies Relations, a job that apparently required someone who could speak 12 different languages and had an infinite capacity for patience with beings who communicated through interpretive dance. "Any regrets?" he asked during one of their weekly communications. Lyra looked out at the colony's rebuilt structures, where humans and Kithara and Vex and even a few reformed Zenithari worked together on projects that would have been impossible under the old system. It wasn't perfect. Nothing involving 47 different species ever was, but it was better. "I regret that it took so long," she said finally. The Empire had been around for 3,000 years. I'd say 6 months was pretty efficient. "I regret that anyone had to die for it. People were already dying. You just made sure it was the right people." Phoenix had always been better at moral philosophy than she was. But then again, he'd also been better at believing that people could change, that systems could be reformed, and that the universe was fundamentally fair if you just gave it enough time. He'd been wrong about that last part, but he'd been right about everything else. The galaxy was a different place now, not perfect, not peaceful, but different. The strong still preyed on the weak, but they had to be more creative about it. Bureaucracy still existed, but it was bureaucracy in service of beings who had a say in how it operated. And somewhere in the former imperial territories, 47 species were learning to live with each other instead of being catalogued by their superiors. You know what the really funny part is, Lyra said, watching a group of Morlock children play with human kids in the colony's central plaza. What's that? The Empire spent 3,000 years studying primitive species to understand what made them dangerous. They catalogued our weapons, our tactics, our technology. They analyzed our psychology, our social structures, our capacity for violence. And they never figured out the one thing that made us actually dangerous. Which was... Lyra smiled, remembering the moment when she'd first realized that the Empire's greatest weakness was also its greatest strength. They'd been so focused on organizing the galaxy that they'd forgotten why anyone would want to live in it. We actually give a damn about each other. The communication ended, with Phoenix's laughter echoing across the light years, and Lyra returned to her work. There were atmospheric processes to maintain, colonies to build, and a galaxy to keep running. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. And after years of war and revolution, honest work felt like the greatest victory of all. Somewhere in the archives of New Defiance, Dr. Kenneth Four's research notes gathered dust. His conclusions about primitive emotional responses in recently spacefaring mammals had been proven correct in every detail except the most important one. He'd assumed that emotional attachment was a weakness rather than a strength. The galaxy was still learning to correct that mistake. And in the end, that might have been the most human thing of all. The stubborn, irrational, completely unreasonable belief that things could be better than they were, and that someone should probably do something about it. Even if that someone was just an engineer from a backwater colony who'd gotten very, very angry about the proper way to treat family.